I am live. Good morning. It is Thursday, the 27th of June. I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. I am at chapter 12 now, the story of Marylda and Rowan. It is a very interesting story. They met in a chateau in France and they are now married and they live in Castle Cloud, which is Rowan's castle, Highland castle, and there is a ghost. Next chapter is entitled SKEAN-DHU, which must be a name, SKEAN-DHU, D-H-U, Scottish. Breakfast in the servants' hall was more silent than usual, for everyone was privately speculating as to the reason for Sir Rowan's unexpected return. In spite of the presence of Mrs. MacTaggart, Elsie was sufficiently indiscreet to remark that something odd must have happened to cause Mr. Henderson to leave without his umbrella and galoshes. "I suppose the minister had to ask your permission before deciding what to do," said Agnes icily. Sandy removed the bones from his kipper with care to conceal that he was worried in case Sir Rowan, bringing the rolls back at 4 in the morning, had any connection with a bonfire which he had helped to construct. Sir Rowan had a temper that could flare up quick as petrol. He hoped that he wouldn't use it against her ladyship. It would be dreadful if they had a real quarrel, just as everything was going so smoothly, and she might take the car with her. He rebuked himself for such an uncharitable thought and choked up on a bone that he had failed to detect. When Elsie took up the breakfast tray, she listened at the door before knocking. It would make matters worse if she interrupted the quarrel. She heard a low murmur of voices and then Marylda's laugh. So much for that sour old Agnes, she thought. She knocked twice before she entered, and while drawing the curtains noticed out of the tail of her eye that her ladyship was blushing and Sir Rowan pretending to be asleep. When Elsie had left the room, Rowan sat up and exclaimed, "Darling, what a narrow escape." He regarded the poached eggs with aversion. "Do you think Angela would eat them to save us offending Mrs. MacTaggart? She likes them mashed into the toast, but don't let her dribble on the eiderdown. Would you like coffee or orange juice, my sweet?" He gazed at her with awe, marveling at the resilience of women, and ran a hand over his bristly chin. "I feel as though I've been thrown down a lift shaft," he said ruefully, "while you remain as fresh as the lovelies who advertise some one or other's super sleep mattress. How do you manage it?" "Assiduous practice in how to please down the centuries. I'm glad you appreciate my efforts." He grinned. "It's a bit of a shock to realize that one's wife has been popping about in space and time. Fancy being made love to by my grandfather. In that case, why shouldn't I be jealous for a change? Why stop at the last generation? Further back, you probably had delicious romps while I was occupied with drab good works." "Darling," he said with mock severity, "if you insist on raking up unsavory incidents from my remote past, I shall deny them flatly. You must promise always to marry me in future." "That would be awkward if we happened to be brother and sister, or you were my dear little son. Incest or Oedipus, what a dreary choice. Still, I suppose it might be possible to love you as much as I do now." "I, too, should regret any change in our present status," she said demurely. "Wouldn't it be interesting if we had a dictaphone under the bed and could play back the record of the last 4 hours as once read on the blurb of a novel, as I once read on the blurb of a novel? The hero and heroine ran the gamut of the emotions." She ticked them off on her fingers. Surprise, bewilderment, indignation, cold anger, hot anger, bitter sarcasm. Darling, we thought up some magnificently dirty cracks during that stage. Then I slapped you, and when instead of slapping me back you sat down on the side of the bed with your head in your hands, I burst into tears and cried until my eyes felt like hairy gooseberries. While I was feeling such abject remorse that I daren't touch you until you said you'd lost your handkerchief. And I was thinking that you were disgusted because I was making a scene and looked so hideous. You're the only woman in the world who looks equally lovely when she's crying. Raindrops on roses. She giggled. A red rose, I'm afraid. My love is like a red, red rose, he said, that softly blows in June. But I blew hard because I was so snuffy, and it's January. It was almost worth the quarrel for the fun of making it up, she added with a candor he found enchanting. And when I told you about me being Emilie, you didn't find it at all incredible. And after we talked and talked, we were suddenly hungry, and you fetched cold chicken and oranges. You peeled the oranges and fed me the pigs, all neatly de-pipped. Then you told me about the little pink pig's nightmare you used to have, and I admitted how terrified Georgina and I were about you and Emilie. Weren't we incredibly silly to make each other miserable by lying, from the best motives? No more lies, he said firmly. She pointed to the emeralds which he had left on the dressing table. You'll soon find out that it isn't always possible to be truthful, except to each other. What do we do with the relics? We can't remark gaily that we found them in the hide, for only Hector and Robbie knew how to open it, and Hector pretended that she'd pinched them. I expect what he really said was, the emeralds are with Emilie, and was pleased with himself for keeping scrupulously to the facts. What about saying that you found them when you went through Emilie's things before burning them? It would be quite consistent with Georgina's view that she was feckless and untidy, for her to have thrown them into a drawer. They could have slipped down behind it. How I shall enjoy telling Janet, unless my better nature stays in the ascendant. To be candid, I was just as jealous of her as you were of Duncan. I'm damned grateful to Duncan for all he's done, but I wish he'd had the sense to tell me what was up. She tweaked his ear affectionately. A little while ago you didn't sound in the least grateful. The poor man was due for some awkward disabilities and would have required at least a year in a plaster cast. I've got a bloody temper, he said despondently. If I'd found him here, you would probably be standing by the window watching me being taken away in a prison van. The picture was so vivid to be funny, and Marylda realized that he was sufficiently overtired to be easy prey for gloom. Darling, you mustn't underrate my wifely devotion. I should have insisted on popping him in the hide, and if his spook turned up, we would have apologized prettily and explained that the whole episode was an unfortunate misunderstanding. He couldn't have taken umbrage, for after all, he is a cadre too. How much do we tell Georgina? Only that I decided to dispose of Emilie's things, no more, because she'd be bound to be upset that Hector didn't trust her enough to ask her to help. Oh, darling, I didn't mean to be tactless. It wasn't lack of trust that kept me quiet, only conceit that made me want to protect you by tackling it on my own. You told Duncan, he said gloomily. Only because I didn't mind him being worried. And anyway, I probably shouldn't have told him nearly so much if he hadn't found me when I fainted on New Year's Eve. You promise categorically and with no reservation that you won't do anything more about Hector without letting me share it. Otherwise I shan't let you out of my sight for a second. My darling, what a temptation. I should like nothing more than ever being out of your sight, than never being out of your sight. She saw he was serious. But I promise, darling, she held up her right hand. If I break my word, may my tongue rot from my mouth and be eaten by carrion crows before Midsummer Day. That's a drastic oath. Where did you get hold of that? From Robbie. It's part of the oath that Cadre swore to the chief on the fealty stone. Didn't you know? I knew it existed. There are several references to it in the history of Cloud, but I didn't know anyone remembered the form of the words. She yawned. I've suddenly gone sleepy. Let's not get up for lunch. I'll ring and tell Elsie that we don't want to be disturbed until 5. I'll order a special nice dinner. There's a tin of caviar which Grummy sent, and we'll be beautifully greedy and eat it all. And then we'll have a woodcock, and I think only fruit after that, unless you would prefer a savory. She was too engrossed in planning the menu to realize that Rowan, who had been taught to regard a day in bed as justified only by serious illness, was having a silent battle with himself. He wanted to prove his loyalty by some extravagant gesture, but couldn't he do something that would not earn Mrs. McTaggart's amazement, Agnes' silent disapproval, Sandy's dismay that he had followed so soft a man to war? "Isn't it a clever idea?" she said happily. "I never sleep properly unless you're with me. And if we got up for lunch, we should either yawn all the afternoon or else go out for a hearty walk and be exhausted by dinner time." He squared his shoulders. "You tell Elsie while I have a bath and shave." He whistled defiantly while the water was running. Damn it! If the servants objected to his behavior, he would take pleasure in teaching them that he was master in his own house. His fears were groundless. Even Anderson hastened to send up his cherished gardenias for the dinner table. "They look like a honeymoon couple," said Sandy confidentially to his sister, after he had taken coffee to the library. "Let this be a lesson to you not to get silly ideas into your head. Quarrelling, indeed. I never heard such nonsense." Elsie was already regretting her tactless remark at breakfast. It was Agnes' fault. She shouldn't have said he would be black angry when he found she'd got rid of all the things that belonged to the First Lady, Hector. "I don't believe Agnes said anything of the sort." "She did. I heard her telling it to Auntie." "Overheard, you mean? You keep your ears to yourself and your nose out of other people's business, and if you don't do as you're told, I shall see to it that my footman doesn't get the same evening off as you." "Oh, Sandy, you couldn't be so unfair," she said, on the verge of tears. "He promised to take me to the pictures." "Well, you remember that, brother or no brother, I'm the butler and what I say goes. So don't let me hear any more talk as to what was or was not buried in the courtyard. Understand?" "Yes, Sandy," she said meekly. Marylda, curled up on the library sofa beside Rowan, looked at him and smiled. "Happy?" "Of course. Aren't I with you?" "We are with each other, and in a way it's for the first time. There were always things we daren't say, things we still had to face alone. Rowan, what shall we do about Hector?" "You're sure something needs doing?" "We've got to make certain that he and Georgina are free to be together. I know she has always been in love with him, and love works both ways. It's only desire that can be unrequited. I thought about Hector a lot when I got to bed. It was really because I couldn't stop thinking that I took the sleeping pills. Emilie was a ghost because she had such a quick death that she was able to ignore it and retreat into her immediate past. We know that Hector hanged himself. At least Georgina's evidence is pretty conclusive. If a pleasant death let Emilie go back into the pleasant part of her life, why shouldn't his suicide drive him to relive the things that he couldn't face? Emilie always tended to take the easy way, and he was equally tiresome by being far too combative. She goes into a self-created heaven, he into an equally real and unnecessary hell. If this is true, then nothing will free him except being helped to recognize that his fears are no longer relevant. But we don't know exactly where they are, what they are. Is he only afraid of having killed his wife? "I don't think so," she said hesitatingly. "At the moment I have nothing better than a vague hunch, but I believe it wasn't the guilt he minded so much as the shame of having tried to avoid the consequences, all the deceits he had to practice in cold blood to substantiate his story." "You're sure he hanged himself?" "I only know what Georgina told me." She shivered. "There's something at the back of my mind that I can't get into focus. However, it isn't important yet. If you could feel me calling you last night sufficiently strongly for it to get through the fog of being bored by Bruce, I don't see why I can't get in touch with Hector, using the affection that Emilie had for him as a call sign and myself as the transmitter. I know it sounds rather odd, but I feel it's really quite reasonable." "I gather that what used to be called thought transference has become a respectable science, said Rowan, pleased to be able to contribute. It may be brain radiations or something, in which case Hector would be short of equipment at the receiving end. Emilie hadn't a brain, so that can't make any difference. It might help me to tune in to him if I held something that he used to wear. He didn't leave a signet ring. It was buried with him. That's why mine only belonged to my father. He paused to light her cigarette. But I've got his SKEAN-DHU. Wouldn't that do? It might, but we shouldn't get the Paris sequence when he went there to fake her burial. I'm not so sure. I've read a bit about psychometry, and apparently the memory of a strongly emotional scene can be just as vivid as the actual event. Shall I try now? She offered. He attempted to conceal his eagerness. Aren't you too tired, darling? I'm far too wide awake to go to bed. I slept more soundly today than I've done in weeks. Well, if anything happens, I shall stop you the moment you get in the least upset. She hoped that nothing would destroy his confidence, that this was no more than an interesting scientific experiment. But how much easier than having to fight against disbelief? Go and get the SKEAN-DHU, she said decisively, and you'd better fetch a pencil and paper at the same time in case I say anything that's worth writing down. When he returned from the strong room, she was lying full length on the sofa by the fire with a rug over her. Sure you're feeling all right? He inquired anxiously. Wouldn't it be wiser to leave it for a few days? I'm just as excited as you are, she said, determined not to let him know she would greatly have preferred to postpone the experiment. The rug is only because I seem to get cold when I've been up to something. Even when it was only seeing Emilie quite casually, I didn't notice it at first. Then you'd better have a drop of brandy before you start. She held the ballon in both hands so that he could not notice they were shaking. He sharpened the 3 pencils he had brought from his study and put them on the arm of his chair beside an open notebook. All set, he said cheerfully. What about you? She smiled and lay back against the cushions, the SKEAN-DHU in her hand. He watched her breathing become gradually slower and deeper. Then she turned on her left side and held the hilt against her forehead. That is the end of chapter 12, so she now goes into her memories. The next chapter is entitled Ghost Story, chapter 13.